Hello, welcome to today's Refugee Studies Centre webinar, the last in this term's series on refugee histories in the Global South. I'm Dr. Anne Irfan. I'm a departmental lecturer in forced migration here at the Refugee Studies Centre, and I'm really pleased to have been convening this series over the last 8 weeks. I'm even more pleased to say that we are going out on a high for our final session this evening because we are privileged to be joined by a leading expert in one of the most significant but least discussed forced migrations of the 20th century. Of course, I'm referring to the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange that took place after the First World War. To speak about this tonight, we are joined by Dr. Aslı Iğsız, who is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, and whose research interests include political violence, eugenics, humanism, spatial segregation and forced migration, and cultural politics. Her first book, Humanism in Ruins, Entangled Legacies of the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange, was published in 2018 with Stanford University Press. I have it here. I can highly recommend it to all of you. This book sought to offer a critique of liberalism from the angle of the management of difference and explored the underlying racialized logics of population transfers, partition, segregation, apartheid, and border walls. Dr. Iğsız is currently working on a new project on the notion of fascist utopias in the contemporary world context and will spend 2021 to 22 in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study of Princeton, completing this monograph. She is also co-editor of the Middle East e-zine Jadaliyya's Turkey page. Dr. Iğsız will speak for around 30 minutes, and we will then have the remainder of our time today going up to 6 o'clock for Q&A and for discussion. As is always the case, please do post your questions for Aslı in the Q&A box, which you will see at the bottom of your Zoom screens now, and you can start doing so almost immediately from when she begins talking, so that way we can get through as many questions as possible. Someone has posted saying that they can't hear what I'm saying. If that is the case for other people as well, can you also please post? Aslı, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, okay. Others are saying they can hear me, so sorry, Francesco, I think that problem might be at your end. Thank you. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over to you, Aslı. Thank you so much again for joining us this evening, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, and it is a great honor to be here today, and I am very grateful to be included in this series and share aspects of my work with you today. Thank you. Before I start my talk, I want to give a little bit of background information about the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange. I am sure that many people are already familiar with the event, but in the case in which those who there might be some people who are less familiar with it, I just wanted to give like a general and very brief background. So the following the 1919-1922 Greco-Turkish War, the Greek and Turkish governments, the emergent Turkish government, have signed a mutual agreement whereby they were going to be exchanging Muslims with their Greek Orthodox, severing the ties of about more than 1.5 million people with their home and homeland. One of the things that this entailed was that the primary category was religion, but it was a compulsory exchange. Therefore, conversion was not really an option. And with the exchange agreement that was signed in Lausanne in 1923, one thing that came up was the idea of including also the Greek Orthodox who had fled the case of the terrains of then New Turkey during the war, and to be included into the forced migration. The Greco-Turkish Exchange of 1923 was the first internationally ratified and executed compulsory population transfer between two countries. It entails the enforced displacements, as I said, of about 1.5 million Muslims and Orthodox Christians. It set an international precedent whereby forced migration is legitimized as a humane solution to conflicts in order to restore social order and stability, promoted as peace at the time. This process has been historically referred to as unmixing and explained through nationalism. This was like the part of the, and thanks to this kind of scholarship, we have learned a lot about the process. And over the last decade, scholars unraveled how the exchanges were actually remarkably diverse in terms of class, language, just that were being spoken. Not everyone spoke the languages of their designated background, and not everyone spoke it without an accent when they did. This also included religious differences. Those who arrived, for example, might have been Muslims to Turkey, but there were, among them, there were differences of like different religious practices. There were among them Bektashis, Mevlevis, among others. This also included different professions and regional differences as well. And when what counted as the category of designation that led to their deportation, therefore did not necessarily mean that those who arrived in the recipient country were harmoniously fit into their new setting. To the contrary, the arriving groups were also coded as different and subjected to differing treatments depending on different locations and how they were coded at the time. Over the last 3 decades or so, the implications of what forced migration entailed exactly was put into question in relation to the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange. For instance, did fleeing for one's life entail forced migration, as were the case, for example, with the partition of India? While we continue to learn from these important debates, my approach to forced migration will be a little bit more different today, as I consider it as part of a broader system of spatial management of difference. So the principal legacy of the 1923 exchange is arguably its contribution to the institutionalization of the management of difference via forced migration, a form of spatial redistribution of peoples, often referred to as unmixing of peoples. This management is configured in terms of numbers and space and justified as a means promoting security and stability. And with the 1923 exchange, it gained a legal framework in the international arena. For those seeking segregative solutions, the 1923 exchange not only constituted a precedent in the international arena, but was also referred to as a successful case of so-called repatriation, especially the case of Turkey. The exchange has therefore become a reference point for others seeking segregative solutions, such as the Potsdam Agreement of 1945, which entailed the deportation of German nationals from Central European countries, the partition of India and Palestine in 1947-48, the deportation of Arab Jews to Israel en masse, and the consideration of sending the Palestinians in their stead. These cases might differ in details, but they share the same segregative logic that sought either in theory or in practice to spatially redistribute different groups according to their backgrounds and designated origins. I use the word designated here because how they were identified did not always necessarily match in these cases how people identified themselves. Informed by the principle of segregation, then, the 1923 exchange is thus organically related to other cases informed by the same racialized logic. I will explain in a minute what I mean by racialized. But to give you a few examples, apartheids, partitions, forced migrations, and the construction of border walls, which unfortunately continue to be relevant in the contemporary world context. In my talk today, I will briefly address how the legacy of the exchange marked the decade following the Second World War, first in terms of being a reference point for the systematized deportations of minorities across continental Europe and beyond, second as a reference point for the rising field of population studies at the time, demography, and related approaches to refugees and refugee integration, that is the management of the aftermath of forced migration, and third, against the backdrop of humanitarianism and its limits at the time. In sum, I will revisit the broader implications of the post-1945 decade management of difference for the contemporary world context by revisiting the implications of the exchange during that time. Given the magnitude of the atrocities of the Second World War, one might have logically expected to see the racialized logics and archives of knowledge, including repertoires of fascism that contributed to such crises in the first place, to be more effectively put into question by the institutions that were established for this purpose. An overview of the 1950s international management of difference, however, demonstrates a different picture. For example, as recent scholarship on the United Nations demonstrates, like Mark Musower's work, for example, on its onset, the UN was built to maintain the status quo rather than the recognition of rights or restitution of dispossession and genocide. So even if the Genocide Convention was passed in 1947, there was no international tribune set to legally hold countries accountable for the atrocities that they had committed. And aside from the fact that many countries resisted it, the way in which Genocide Convention was approved only emphasized individual rights at the time in the context of the UN and not collective rights. And what this entailed was opening the path to individual vetting of asylum applicants, with the exception of the Holocaust survivors in general. In the post-war era, minorities were widely considered as sources of instability and potential obstacles to peace, configured as a problem to be solved as if conflicts were biologically dispositioned, rather than being the logical outcome of dispossession, exploitation, political violence, struggles over sovereignty, or the racialized hierarchization of different groups, among other factors, such as economic factors. Demographic policies developed in that era included enforced assimilation and mass transfers of minorities in Europe and beyond under the guise of bringing social order. It clearly mattered which groups' numbers were to be regulated, not merely through birth control or mass killings, but also systematized population transfers en masse, operating on a segregative principle. To be clear, this doesn't mean that mass killings disappeared, but that deportation now accompanied mass killings as a systematic way of getting rid of the undesirable groups. And instead of maybe boosting the birth rates with the groups deemed to be desirable, these are demographic categories, desirables, undesirables. Instead of boosting the birth rates at the time to generate a greater number of the so-called desirable groups, importing these groups indexed as such also became systematized at that time. So yes, the mass killings and genocides did not disappear from the world, neither did birth control. But what we do see after the war is a systematization of this logic in population management via segregation and mobility, particularly after the Second World War. Just to briefly open a parenthesis here, in my own work, I conceptualize such demographic policies as biopolitics and focus on its segregative function as the regulation of categorized bodies in terms of numbers within a given space. Throughout the 1950s, spatial redistribution of racialized populations widely continued at a local level in different parts of the world. The 1923 exchange constituted, as I mentioned, a reference point for such policies. And racialized thinking was pervasive, even in cases where race did not appear to be a primary concern, in cases where religion was a category, for instance. And now I can open up by what I mean by racialized thinking. What I mean by racialized thinking is an embodied codification of difference through direct implications of bloodlines, designated origins, and lineage, and the belief in an embodied, biologized essence that is configured as transmitted and transmittable from one generation to the next. Racialized thinking is therefore embedded in different categorizations of difference and is not limited to the hard category of race. This doesn't by all means make them the same. But what this means is racial categorizations were so salient that they seeped into how different groups were viewed, religion being included. And actually, I should also emphasize here that even though the 1923 exchange was based on the principle of religion, for instance, conversion was not given as an option. Therefore, it was not really necessarily religion, but it was also like an embodied identification that was in question. Spatial regulations of difference, therefore, may differ in details and take different forms depending on the context, but they shared the general concern of with unmixing, a charged term with heavy eugenicist implications, and as mixing being degenerate and as an undesirable, and mixing as that has attributes of like a purity that are implied, and segregation that exemplify this trend. In that context, every case of mobility in relation to segregative mode of biopolitics was and still is simultaneously a case of social and physical immobility. This also means that minorities in different settings either were forced to relocation or separated, segregated, and those who were displaced were again marked as different in the recipient countries as refugees that needed to be regulated. Or in cases, even in cases where, like Greece and Turkey, for instance, where the incoming groups were given citizenship, they were still perceived as groups that needed to be regulated, and different policies were put into place. Unsurprisingly, the fusion of fascist eugenics and demography has continued to inform policies of forced migration and refugee integration in the post-war era. Scholars who had previously supported fascism or adopted the biological approach to social matters to take the population as a site of improvement, which is how I define eugenics, moved swiftly to the terrains of refugee study after the war. Those who previously supported fascism, like renowned Italian eugenicist and statistician Corrado Gini, well known for his Gini coefficient in statistics to calculate income inequality. He collaborated with Turkish sociologists and philosophers such as Hilmi Ziya Ülken and Turkey's leading eugenicist psychiatrist Fahrettin Kerim Gökay to work on the refugee crisis of the post-war. I mean, the Second World War. Their contribution led their contribution after the Second World War led to the founding of a refugee study association in Europe, and several years later to launching a sister organization that expanded its scope from Europe to the study of refugees in the world, the Association for the Study of the World Refugee Problem. My work more focuses on the European Refugee Association, but the sphere of influence of the associations was broad. Members of the Council of Europe, UNHCR, and the Red Cross, as well as leading political figures, regularly took part in their conventions. Turkish eugenicist Gökay served as the elected president of both refugee associations for about 10 years. The objective was articulated as alleviating pain and human suffering and to end human misery. Another eugenicist who served in the refugee associations was Karl Valentin Müller, a German sociologist who rose to prominence during the Third Reich and who believed that social achievement is directly correlated with inherited racial characteristics and that social matters required eugenic solution. For example, in order to solve the problem of work, he suggested the sterilization of inferior groups and individuals and otherwise limiting their reproduction. His racialist eugenics also extended to breeding quality workers. In that respect, Müller believed Nordic groups were biologically superior and advocated giving them better housing, job security, and hereditary titles. And after the war, He worked on the refugee integration in Hanover and also chaired the German section of the Refugee Association, chaired by the Turkish eugenicist Fahrettin Kerim Gökay. These scholars, eugenicists, brought their expertise into the refugee integration study. In the thousands of pages of their work, we see a fusion of fascism, eugenics, and demography in the refugee and migrant integration studies. In September 1954, the European Refugee Association held its convention in Istanbul, the hometown of its Turkish eugenicist president Gökay, who was also both the mayor and governor of the city. At the convention in Istanbul, Turkish government officials and Fahrettin Kerim Gökay repeated the same mantra of no more suffering and declared their wish to end all human misery, only to be involved in a plot that targeted the remaining Greek Orthodox that were excluded from the exchange in Istanbul and on the islands. This was the program that targeted the remaining Greek Orthodox of Istanbul within a year. When the state orchestrated anti-Greek pogrom, comparable to racist riots in some aspects, swept the city on 6-7 September 1955, Gökay was the official responsible of Istanbul and the safety of its residents. He was reportedly complicit in the plot. Menderes and Gökay, the Turkish Prime Minister Menderes at the time, and Gökay were thus instrumental in reproducing exactly the same kind of human suffering they had grandly condemned the year before at the Refugee Association meeting in Istanbul. Who exactly then, one might ask, qualifies as human? And how is the human pain coded in that respect? While the Refugee Association was not lacking eugenicists, the most controversial figure of these circles was arguably Corrado Gini, well known, as I mentioned earlier, for developing the Gini coefficient. In Italy, he was a former president of the Italian Society of Genetics and Eugenics. In 1936, he spent a year teaching at Harvard University. He also received an honorary degree in sciences from there. And by that time, he had published The Scientific Basis of Fascism in English in 1927, had a significant impact on Mussolini's political campaign, and served as president of Central Institute of Statistics in Italy. That Gini was a complex and controversial figure, there is no doubt. Indeed, in the late 1950s, Gini collaborated with scholars in the racialist camp that were either overtly in favor of segregation of the United States or did not oppose it and indirectly supported it. He is widely acknowledged as a leading figure in the first fusion of fascism, demography, and eugenics. And he continued this line of work in the context of refugee integration, and he was instrumental in the founding of the European and World Refugee Associations that I mentioned earlier. In 1950, Gini was invited to Turkey to found the Institute of Statistics at Istanbul University, where he would also teach a course on demography. The Turkish parliament assembled to issue his work permit, and he was offered a handsome salary, about 15 times more than his Turkish colleague, Hilmi Ziya Ülken, and his wage. Ülken is a Turkish philosopher with whom he collaborated and who also taught at the same university. Ülken was the president of the Turkish Sociological Society, and together with the vice president of the same organization, author Peyami Safa, widely claimed to be a Nazi sympathizing novelist, he organized tea receptions to introduce Gini to other colleagues and students in Turkey. In 1950s, after the Refugee Association was established, he also presented his work on the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange at the Refugee Association's meeting. So Gini's lectures at Istanbul University addressed demographic changes with forced migration, with direct references to the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange. Today, the lecture notes from Gini's Istanbul University course and translated works from the fascist era, actually, can be found at the Turkish Parliament's library. In Turkey, he was a valued scholar. At the Refugee Association, Gini promoted the notion of the human capital, calling for the engagement with the refugees and the displaced in terms of labor-ready bodies whose training was already paid by the country of origin and therefore considered to be a profitable business for the host country. So this is also important because this means that the body, like the embodied identification, was not just in terms of the designated background, but it also had to do with, in the Refugee Association, the notion of human capital being pushed as also reconfigured as the labor-ready bodies, and who was going to be vetted in the process, who was going to be accepted for those who were not deemed to be national refugees, meaning whose designated background was not aligned with the recipient country, depending on the context. So it is not surprising that Gini is also concerned with labor and considers refugees who are seeking new homes as human capital, who can be profitable business for the recipient country. And yet what happens to those who do not qualify as a human capital, if we were to use Gini's terms? At the 1954 Refugee Association Conference in Istanbul, Walter Schatzel, a German scholar of international law, addressed the case of those immigrants and refugees who have no exchange value as capital and are thus deemed to be the undesirables. He explained that this group of refugees are often called social burden, bagage social. And likewise, Karl Valentin Müller, who also I had mentioned earlier, who promoted before the end of the Second World War, the breeding of the superior workers. He also referred to those who were unable to work at the Refugee Association as the dead weight, I quote, dead weight for the society, unquote. The so-called social burden included, I quote, the old and sickly, the orphans, criminals, and the asocials. In short, all those people that no state wants to receive, unquote, and who, according to Schatzel, cannot be easily employed. It is indeed a primarily economic move that was being materialized, one that was focusing on translating the refugee or the immigrant into labor productive bodies, but addressed in humanist terms via the concurrent mobilization of discourses to alleviate pain and suffering. Integration thus implied both economic productivity and cultural assimilation. Considering the prevalence of biopolitical approaches in configuring social order as a means to remedy the so-called crisis, not just as a social, political, or economic problem, but also as an epistemological one, it is not surprising that controversial eugenicists found a niche in matters of refugee integration in the aftermath of the war. Immigrants who were sick, orphaned, or too old, that is, for the most part, those who were in a precarious position, were considered to be a social burden, a dead weight on society. These dynamics in turn raise questions about the limits of humanitarian discourses to alleviate human suffering. If the socially vulnerable are considered to be a nuisance, what exactly is defined and recognized as pain beyond the humanist abstraction of violence and dispossession? So where does this lead us? More than 90 years after the 1923 exchange, Greece and Turkey are implicated in yet another mass human displacement. The Aegean Sea, that was once the site of the fleeing for the Greek Orthodox during the war, and presumably of repatriation during after the exchange agreement, is again a site of relocation. Unlike the subjects of the exchange of 1923, the refugees who are or those people who are trying to, on a daily basis, try to relocate themselves, coming from the Middle East, trying to relocate themselves and reach European Union, are being sent off. And unlike the case of those who were subjected to the exchange of 1923, those who are returned today are not considered to be nationals who are being sent to territories where they presumably belong. Rather, EU officials appear to index refugees as superfluous overpopulation, like members of undesirable groups to be kept outside the external borders of the EU. In 2016, the Turkish government made a commitment to seal off its borders, turning them effectively into a wall that separated Europe from Middle Eastern refugees. At that time, the Turkish government announced that it wanted to give limited employment authorization and consideration of permanent residency to the qualified and educated Syrian refugees, signaling that there would be an individualized vetting process, only to discover that this process had already taken place in the EU and that those refugees were already taken by Germany, the human capital. Meanwhile, neo-Nazi groups traveled to Greece to push migrant refugee boats back to the water in the event that they could reach the shores of Greece. And now new fascist movements and actors demand the forced migration of the non-whites from the European Union and the United States, where demands of generating white Christian nation state, segregating the undesirables have accelerated in the context of the United States under the Trump administration. Present-day securitarian campaigns reproduce eugenicist paradigms of crime, casting categorized groups as potential threats based on their background, while increasing the racialization of the notion of security. Recent scholarship has called attention to the fact that when an act considered to be a crime is committed, the offense falls within the scope of law. But with securitarianism, it is the probability of a perceived threat that is anticipated. And this anticipation informs the security apparatus in racialized terms. This is not new, it just is accelerated. Consider the racist and xenophobic anti-immigration policies of the United States that have most recently placed immigrant children in cages. Can they be divorced from the underlying logic of the system that undermines Black lives, or are they too part of the present history of how racialized difference is managed? One of the reasons why I'm mentioning this is also in 2015, on the 60th anniversary of the anti-Greek pogroms, the Turkish activists came up with signs that said "never again" to condemn the anti-Greek pogroms, the same day as Kurdish towns were being razed to ground zero. Can we divorce these histories? How many histories of the present should we be tracing? Is it just enough to look at what is happening to the Greek Orthodox communities that are in Turkey that are only reduced to a sheer number of 2,000, while groups that are in larger numbers continue to be targeted in different ways? Indeed, is not the very act of cordoning off the multiple local histories of the management of difference into discrete, disjointed narratives belong solely to the history of one or another group, not part of that very management? Does not our inability to view the many layers of the palimpsest together at once reinscribed into one another feed into the very hegemonic state narratives of law and order or security that perpetuate these violent histories? It is within this framework that I propose to view legacies of the 1923 exchange beyond the Greek and Turkish borders and to reconsider the broader implications of forced migration in that context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aslı, for talking us not only through the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange itself, but also situating this in relation to so many bigger universal themes and also to the contemporary issues we're seeing in the same region around forced migration.